Chapter 4. Hyacinth Priest. Jeremy stared at the direction sheet. The top of the page had changed. Where it had once read, "How to hatch a dragon's egg," it now said, "The care and feeding of dragons." When had it changed, and how? Fingers trembling, he picked up the paper. The dragon tickled his ear with its tongue as he began to read. "The care and feeding of dragons. You have been chosen to care for a rare and precious creature, Jeremy Thatcher. When fully grown, your dragon will be unimaginably powerful, but in the early stages of its development, it is very vulnerable. Like any infant, it must be cared for if it is to survive. To begin with, you must guard the fact of its existence. The world at large does not love dragons. Should your dragon be discovered, it will almost certainly be taken from you. As to feeding, while mature dragons prefer live food, an infant will be satisfied with something that has already been killed. Small gobbets of meat, such as chicken livers, are particularly appropriate. When the dragon is older, it will be able to hunt for itself. Dragons grow rapidly, so you will need to think about protecting your pets before long. Eventually, your dragon will shed its skin. Do not be alarmed by this. However, you must save the skin, as well as the baby teeth, which will begin to fall out at about the same time. You must also save as much of the eggshell as possible. These things will be very important when midsummer night arrives. Your dragon must have a name. Actually, every dragon is born with a name. However, since these birth names must remain secret, you should provide another name as soon as possible. Finally, your dragon will be very sensitive to your own emotional state. It would be wise to avoid extreme agitation while raising the dragon. If you do not, trouble may result. It's a good thing Mom and Dad sleep late on Saturdays, thought Jeremy, as he tiptoed into the kitchen. Opening the refrigerator, he stared inside. Suddenly he became aware of something big and furry standing next to him. "Grief," he whispered, "get out of here." The golden retriever looked up at him with a wounded expression. However, if the dog was wounded, he was not offended enough to leave. Leaning against Jeremy, he stared into the refrigerator. Boy and dog moved their heads in unison as they scanned the lower shelves, which were filled with plastic containers. Jeremy knew that most of them held stuff like leftover rice pudding. But he knew, too, that there must be some chicken livers here. His father ate them all the time. Gathering his courage, he pulled open the meat tray. There they were! Jeremy shivered as he pulled the container out of the fridge. "Gross," he moaned, when he opened it and actually saw the chunks of slippery purple meat. How can Dad even touch these things, he thought, much less eat them? His revulsion was multiplied when he felt something wet on his bare foot and looked down to find that Grief was drooling on him. Jeremy shook his foot. The glob of slobber spread out a bit, but otherwise stayed in place. He pulled a paper towel from the roll sitting on the counter and bent down to wipe away the dog's spit. "You make me sick," he hissed at Grief. The dog licked his face. Totally disgusted, Jeremy pulled one of the chicken livers out of the container and threw it across the room. Grief ran after it with such lust that he smashed into a cupboard. "What's going on down there?" Jeremy flinched. "Just giving Grief his breakfast, Dad," he yelled, hoping his father would be too groggy to remember that it had been months since he had voluntarily fed the dog. "Well, do it a little more quietly," shouted Dr. Thatcher. "Some people are still sleeping around here." "Okay, Dad. Sorry about that." Jeremy waited, but there were no more words from upstairs. He relaxed. His father must have collapsed back into sleep. Walking on tiptoe, he led Grief outside and clipped his collar to the chain attached to the corner of the garage. He slipped back inside, gently pulling the door closed behind him. That was better. He would never get these stupid things upstairs with Grief around. Back at the counter, Jeremy pulled out 2 more livers. Ugh, they feel as bad as they look. Quivering with disgust, he dropped the cold meat onto a saucer, then put the container back into the fridge. Picking his way through the cats, he shut the kitchen door and started up the stairs. When he entered his room, the dragon was nowhere to be seen. Where did it go? He thought desperately. As he was heading for his desk, he heard a soft hissing. He looked up. He saw the dragon swooping toward him, its pointy red wings stretched to the full. "Yow!" cried Jeremy, jumping back. The dragon landed on the edge of the saucer and began to nip at one of the livers. Jeremy held the saucer at arm's length. "You," he said to the dragon, "are a troublemaker, and you have bad taste." But as he set the saucer down, with the dragonlet still clinging to the edge, Jeremy again found himself entranced by the strange beauty of the little beast. When the dragon was done eating, it walked across the desk and began to climb Jeremy's arm. Its tiny claws felt like needles against his skin. "Ouch!" cried Jeremy. "Cut that out!" The dragon ignored his protest. It continued up his arm until it reached his shoulder, where it settled down with a little sigh that sent a puff of hot air across his cheek. Jeremy slid the saucer aside and pulled the instruction sheet out of the desk drawer. "Your dragon must have a name," he read aloud. He reached up to pat the little animal, which had curled up on his shoulder. "What about it, beastie?" he asked softly. "What should we call you?" To his surprise, the dragon answered him. The answer did not come in words. It came as a feeling of not knowing that reminded Jeremy of the blank sensation he got whenever Mr. Siegel called on him in math. He turned his head and looked at the dragon out of the corner of his eyes. It yawned, opening its mouth so wide that Jeremy could no longer see the jewel-like eyes. Jeremy laughed. It had never occurred to him that a dragon could be so cute. But this one certainly was. At least it was now. He wasn't sure what it would be like when it got bigger. Maybe being small made things cute. "I suppose that's true," he said out loud, thinking of the women who were always coming up to pinch him on the cheek and tell him how cute he was, as if being cute were something wonderful. Personally, he hated being cute and being small. "At least you'll grow out of it," he said to the dragon. He thought about that for a second. The dragon might stop being cute fast once it started to grow. The idea was frightening. Just how big was this thing going to get? Other than mentioning that it would be large enough to eat the family pets, the care and feeding sheet wasn't very specific about growth. Nothing it said indicated the upper limit of the dragon's size. Would it get to be as big as a car, a bus, a house? It was time to do some research. Since Jeremy's bike was broken, he had to go to the library on foot. The head librarian was just taking down the closed sign when he arrived, puffing with exhaustion from having run all the way. She took one look at him and said, "Overdue homework, Jeremy?" He shook his head. "I just need to find out some stuff," he gasped. "It's wonderful to see someone so hungry for knowledge," she replied, sounding as if she didn't quite believe him. Jeremy gave her a fake smile and headed for the back of the library. His smile became real when he saw the long-haired children's librarian. She was sitting at her desk and staring at a book with a look of fierce concentration. The sign in front of her said, "Ms.Hyacinth Priest." Jeremy crossed the room quietly and stood by Miss Priest's desk. After a moment, she looked up. "Good morning, Jeremy," she said. Her voice had a hint of music to it, and he always liked to hear her talk. "Have you come for some more art books?" He shook his head. "New topic today. I need to find out about dragons." Miss Priest looked at him carefully. "Fascinating creatures," she said at last. "Let's see what we can dig up." She stood towering over Jeremy and led him past rows of books until they came to the section she was looking for. She bent forward to scan the shelves, causing the blue beads of her long, dangling earrings to brush the sides of her face. "Aha!" she said, reaching out to snatch up a thin volume. "I thought you might be hiding here." Without looking up, she handed the book to Jeremy. "Now, where's your friend?" she muttered. Spess doesn't do libraries, said Jeremy, before he realized she had been addressing the book. Suddenly her hand darted forward again. Here we go, she said triumphantly. She handed Jeremy a medium-sized book. A wonderful red dragon reared across the green cover, its claws outstretched, a shaft of flame rocketing from its mouth. Jeremy wished desperately that he could draw like that. 10 minutes later, Jeremy was sitting at a long wooden table with a thick stack of books beside him. He opened the first and started looking for something, anything, that would tell him what to do with a dragon. He had no idea how long he had been reading when his concentration was interrupted by a pang of hunger shooting through his stomach. He closed the book and rubbed his belly. How long has it been since I ate? Glancing at the clock on the wall, he was surprised to see it was only 10:15. He decided to read a little longer. He was enjoying the books, even if they didn't provide much useful information. The only problem was that in almost every story, the dragon got killed at the end, usually with good reason, since most of them were extremely nasty. About the only good dragons he had found were Chinese. He wondered if dragons were really that terrible, or if people just said bad things about them because they looked so scary. More to the point, what was his dragon going to be like? Opening the green book, Jeremy found a story about a dragon named Nidhogg. He wrote the name on his notepad. The list of possible dragon names was about the only real stuff he had gotten so far. He had barely finished writing Nidhogg when the next hunger pang hit. His stomach began to rumble threateningly. Gathering the books he wanted to check out, he took them to Miss Priest. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Not everything," he admitted. Hyacinth Priest paused, then leaned toward him and said softly, "Just exactly what are you looking for?" Jeremy swallowed. "This is going to sound silly," he began. Before he could finish, his stomach began making a noise like an erupting volcano. Miss Priest nodded. "Very silly," she said seriously. Jeremy blushed. "I mean, my question will sound silly." The librarian looked directly into his eyes. "No question is silly if you really want to know the answer," she said fiercely. "Okay," said Jeremy. "Then what I want to know is, do you have anything on how to raise a dragon?" Miss Priest smiled. "Of course," she said softly.